So for our very first dose of HR 2021 with our first session, we've got a gentleman who really strongly believes in changing workplaces for the better. Let's introduce first of all right now a man who's going to show us how to unleash your workplace revolution, co-founder of Corporate Rebels, Mr. Pim de Morree. Pim, I've already seen you already. You're there. Hi, Pim. How you doing?
Hi, good morning. I'm very well.
Feeling good?
Yeah, very good.
Wonderful.
Very
Where are you right now, Pim?
Here in Eindhoven.
Where are you? You're in Eindhoven?
Eindhoven, the Netherlands, yes.
Eindhoven in the Netherlands. We're here in Belgrade and you're beaming out to the world. Pim, over to you. And remember, at the end, I'll come back with the questions the burning questions people want to ask you right at the end. Over to you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And I'm 100% sure that people will have loads of questions after the session because what I'm going to share with you today in about 25 minutes is all the stuff that we learned over the past 5 years from visiting some of the world's most radical workplaces. I'm going to talk first a little bit about Corporate Rebels and why we started the company. And then I'm going to give you some examples of organizations doing things very differently in order to engage and motivate their people to a very high extent. But as I mentioned, first a little bit about Corporate Rebels and especially about the background and the reason why we started this company. So Joost and myself, we co-founded the company about 6 years ago when we had both become extremely frustrated with the way that the organizations we previously worked for were organized. So we both graduated in engineering degrees, started to work for 2 different companies, doing the thing that we had studied for. Joost being a nanotechnologist, myself being an industrial engineer. And we both started to do the thing we loved and the thing we studied for. And during those 3 years in these corporate environments, we actually enjoyed the content of the work itself. However, we became very, very frustrated by the way things were organized and by the way the company was structured. So, for example, we were extremely frustrated by the fact that there were so many rules and there was so much bureaucracy that there was no room for any creativity or entrepreneurship. If you wanted to do something, you just had to make sure you were doing everything according to the rules, which wasn't very motivating to a lot of people in the organizations. There was a boss telling us exactly how we should be doing our jobs. Also there was no freedom whatsoever to decide anything for yourself, not even when you would come to the office or where you would like to work. So over those 3 years working in these corporate environments, we became very frustrated with the way things were set up. And we said to each other, we cannot imagine ourselves working for 40 more years in corporate environments like this. We feel that we need to challenge the way and change the way companies work because just like us, unfortunately, a lot of other people are also experiencing this frustration at work. And when we started Corporate Rebels, at first we dived into the research on this topic. And I can tell you the research is quite clear in the fact that today's workplaces are painfully broken. If you look at a number of those studies being done on the topic on, for example, engagement, you see that 15% of the world's working population is engaged at work, just 15%. So these are the people that are going into the office, are truly passionate about their work and their work environment. There's 67% of the people being disengaged. So those are the people, they come into the office, do what they're being told, but are not truly passionate about their work and their work environment. And then there's a very painful group of 18% of the people being actively disengaged. Meaning these people are so frustrated by their work or their work environment that they start sabotaging the workplace. So the group of actively disengaged people is larger than the group of engaged people. And then there's a big majority of 67% of the people not really caring about their work and their work environment. So apparently we're disengaging people to quite a significant extent. Then if you look at the burnout symptoms in today's workplaces, you see that 23% of the people always or often experience symptoms of burnout. 44% of the people sometimes experience this, and just 33% of the people never have any burnout symptoms at work. Meaning that we're also literally making people sick because of the way that we organize work. And you can see this in a number of things. For example, the high levels of sick leave in traditional companies, with a lot of people calling in sick because they are becoming so frustrated and even physically ill because of the way the companies are structured. And then thirdly, another painful statistic, according to this study, 40% of the working population feels that their job makes no useful contribution to society, meaning that they feel that their work doesn't contribute to anything meaningful. So if you look at some of these statistics, and these are just some of them, there are way more out there, and they've been very clear for the past few decades that we're disengaging people at work, making them sick, and they feel meaningless at work, or many people at least do. So apparently we're doing something wrong, right? And this is exactly what we experienced ourselves in our previous jobs, where we also became frustrated with the way that the company was structured. On the other end, we heard about companies that were doing things really different. We heard about companies with no hierarchy, no functional hierarchy. We heard of companies where people could set their own working hours, set their own working location, sometimes even set their own salaries. And we heard about these companies, but it was so far from our reality that we wanted to start researching these companies to figure out how to make work more fun. So 6 years ago, we quit our jobs and we created a list of companies and academics, CEOs, and entrepreneurs that we wanted to study and visit to understand how we could make work more fun. And the idea of Corporate Rebels that we are going to research these companies and then share as much as possible through our blog, through our book, through talks like these, and through an online academy where we teach people how to become a more progressive organization. And we created this list of more than 150 organizations. And over time, we visited more than 150 of these companies, academics, CEOs, and entrepreneurs to truly understand how work could be organized differently. So really learning from these pioneering organizations. Over time, and we are still doing this at the moment, but over time, we kind of could see a clear distinction between progressive organizations and more traditional organizations. And we summarize them into 8 trends. And I'd like to share these 8 trends to give you an idea of what these progressive organizations do different than their more traditional counterparts. And many of you will recognize the left-hand side of this slide because it is the more traditional side of organizations. It is, for many, unfortunately, reality of today's work. And on the right-hand side, you will see the focus of more progressive organizations. So the first trend is a move from profit to purpose and values. So from these pioneering companies believe that the main reason they exist is not to make money or to increase shareholder value or focus on their next quarterly returns. Instead, these organizations believe that they contribute to something much more important. They have a clear purpose to what they're trying to achieve, and they have very clear values in place, telling them how they want to achieve that purpose. Of course, making money is important for them as it is for any other organization. They just don't believe that that's their sole reason to exist. They believe they exist for something more important, and that if they focus on their purpose, the profit and the money will follow naturally. And they often compare it to oxygen for human beings. They say, well, of course we need oxygen and we need to breathe to stay alive, but it's not our reason of existence. And they see profit and purpose in a very similar way, believing that they as an organization want to contribute to something much more important than just making money and increasing shareholder value. The second trend is a move from hierarchical pyramids to a so-called network of teams structure. And I think we're all familiar with the hierarchical pyramid, right? Where you have the traditional organizational structure with the CEO on top, in a pyramid shape where you have all the middle management layers in between, and then you get to the people at the front line who are doing most of the actual operational work. These pioneering organizations believe that that's an outdated way to organize. It worked really well 150 years ago when things were very much the same every single day. But today, when the world is changing so quickly and companies need to constantly adapt to based on their changing business environment, they cannot be organized anymore in this fixed hierarchical pyramid. Instead, they want to be organized into a network of team structure where you have lots of small teams with lots of autonomy and lots of decision-making power, who can make most of the operational decisions themselves. And therefore reducing the hierarchy in these companies to a very significant extent. The third trend is from directive leadership to supportive leadership. So how can you move away from the idea that bosses know everything, that they can always make the most important decisions in the best possible way? And how can you instead focus on creating a workplace where leaders are truly supportive to their teams? Doing those things that will help their teams to excel. Not making decisions for them, but creating the right type of environment where the teams can do their best possible work. Some companies go really far in this. And just to give you one example, we visited a company in Switzerland where all of the employees could select all of their leaders in the organization. So instead of having top-down appointed leaders and managers, in that organization, teams would select their own leaders and even would elect the CEO every single year. So it was a very democratic organization, very different to what many traditional organizations are structured like. The fourth trend is a move from planning and predicting to experimenting and adapting. So moving away from the idea that you can perfectly predict what's going to happen in next year and the next 5 years, and creating all kinds of detailed plans around those predictions. This, once again, used to work really well in the past, when things are more or less the same every single day and every single year. But nowadays, when things change so quickly, with new products and services emerging, with new competitors emerging every day, companies need to be much more adaptable, and therefore they cannot focus anymore on creating these long-term strategic plans with all these milestones in between. But instead, they have to focus on a clear vision, but then constantly experimenting and adapting as they go. For example, a beautiful example of a company we visited in Sweden. It's an organization called Handelsbanken, a large bank spread out throughout Europe and employing 14,000 people, but not having a single annual budgeting cycle in place. Meaning that instead of focusing 2 months of the year on annual budgeting and thinking what money each team and each department will need for the next year, they instead focused their time on actually supporting their employees to deliver good products and services to customers. So not wasting their time on bureaucracy, but instead focusing on constantly experimenting and adapting to be able to support their customers as good as possible. The fifth one is from rules and control to freedom and trust. So how can you actually get rid of all of those rules that tell people how they should be doing their job? And how can you instead focus on creating an environment of freedom and trust, where people are expected to make the right decisions themselves? When people are at home, we don't tell them how they should raise their children. We don't tell them how they should buy a house. We believe and we trust people to be able to make those decisions themselves. But once they enter the workplace, they aren't even allowed to spend 500 euros of company money because we don't trust them. Well, these pioneering organizations don't believe that to be true, and instead also give people lots of freedom, lots of trust to make their own decisions, to give them a lot of autonomy so they can do their best possible work, instead of having all of these rules and policies that dictate how people should be behaving. Then the sixth trend is a move from centralized authority to distributed authority. So how can you push decision-making as far to the front line as possible? So people at the front line in close contact with customers and suppliers are actually the ones who can make the most important decisions themselves as quickly as possible. Then from secrecy to radical transparency. So companies open up all kinds of information for people to be able to make the right decisions and to be truly engaged at work. For example, opening up the salary levels of everyone in the company, or the company financials to show to everyone how their work is influencing the top and the bottom line of the organization. But also company performance and team performance. How can you open up that information so people can truly get a good sense of how things are going in their organization? And the final one, from job descriptions to talents and mastery. So how can you get away from the idea that you hire specific individuals for a specific job description and that states their day-to-day activities, And how can you instead focus on creating a work environment where people get to find and discover their main talents, and then to craft a job around those specific talents? So that's a completely different way of looking at people and talent in the workplace. And by doing this, organizations really allow their employees to use their main talents, and are therefore also to be much more motivated because they get to do the thing they like to do most. So a brief summary of what organizations do with a couple of examples of companies and how they put this into practice. One important disclaimer: this is not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's not as simple as just trying to implement all of these things to then create a happy, engaging workplace. What is much more important is that you start a dialogue with your employees to figure out what are some of the things we desperately need to change. Where do we have to shift from traditional to more progressive in order to create a more engaging and more motivating work environment? So, besides these 8 trends, I want to share you one example of a company that is pioneering in many of these trends. And it's a beautiful example that very clearly shows how radical some of these companies are organized, and also how different that is from very traditional organizations. And the organization I'd like to talk about is a Dutch home care nursing organization called Buurtzorg. It literally means neighborhood care, and the company was founded 15 years ago by Jos de Blok, the man you see here. And he was before working in a very traditional home care nursing organization where he worked very traditionally, first as a home care nurse himself, and then later as an innovation director. And he felt that in those traditional work environments with a very clear top-down management structure, he felt that the skills and the talents of nurses weren't fully used. And they were so much forced into this traditional working model that the nurses, for example, would just receive a day-to-day schedule at the beginning of their day. That schedule was created by a planning department that was very far removed from what was actually going on at the front line. And these nurses then had, for example, 10 minutes to spend at this patient to take care of tasks A and B. Then they had to move to the next patient, and they also got a specific amount of minutes to perform a specific amount of tasks. And this didn't leverage at all the skills and the talents of these nurses, because they just had to listen to what was in their planning and and what the planning department created for them, but they didn't have any freedom or autonomy in how they were actually delivering good healthcare. So he felt that the organization needed to be set up differently. So he started Buurtzorg in 2005, together with a team of 4 nurses, and they said they were going to organize the company around the autonomy of nurses. And at first, of course, this was easy. They started with 4 nurses and gave them all the autonomy they needed to do their job well. But when they started to grow, every time that the team grew over 12 people, they split up the team into 2 teams of 6, until those teams again would grow until 12 nurses, and then again they would split. So allowing the company then to grow exponentially, but still having this autonomy of nurses as their main focus point in the organization. So every single home care nursing team at Buurtzorg still today has the responsibility of one specific neighborhood or village or part of a city. And within that specific neighborhood, these self-managing teams get to decide themselves about hiring decisions, firing decisions, planning the work, executing the work, onboarding new team members. All of this stuff happens in the teams themselves. And interestingly, the organization has grown to 15,000 employees, yet they don't employ a single manager in the entire organization. So to briefly share you some statistics on Buurtzorg, they employ 15,000 people, more than 1,000 self-managing teams. So as I mentioned, not a single manager in the entire organization, just a group of about 25 coaches who take care of all of the coaching work that needs to be done. So they actually support the teams if they run into conflicts or challenges that they cannot solve themselves. But the coaches don't have any decision-making power over the teams. The teams in the end decide themselves. Then there's only 50 people support staff in the headquarters, meaning that on an organization of 15,000 people, there's just 50 people to support them with the bureaucracy they cannot avoid as an organization. For example, dealing with the insurance companies and other administrative work that they don't want to bother the nursing teams with. Overhead costs, as you can imagine, are quite a bit lower at Buurtzorg. They're 67% lower because of this very small headquarter function that they have. They have the highest employee and client satisfaction of any home care nursing organization in the Netherlands. And as a result, extremely low levels of staff turnover. And maybe even more interestingly, they cure patients faster than their traditional counterparts. Meaning that it isn't just more effective, but also more engaging to employees. It's more interesting also from an overhead cost perspective. So this organization, Buurtzorg, shows, as many of the other pioneers on our list, that work can be organized quite differently and quite different from what we're used to. And interestingly, as we're talking today at this HR conference, Buurtzorg doesn't have an HR department. Almost all of the tasks that normally an HR department would take care of are transferred to the operational teams themselves, meaning that these teams are responsible themselves for hiring, firing, onboarding. Only some administrative stuff is done by the headquarters, but there's no HR department that's dictating how these teams should be doing all of the tasks and activities around human resources. So I think an interesting example of an organization doing things differently, and from all of these companies that we've researched over the past 6 years, we learned that there's a different way of working out there that many companies haven't explored yet. But if we look at today's workplaces with the high levels of disengagement, with a lot of people feeling burned out, and also a lot of people not experiencing any meaning at work, desperately, we need to start changing the way we organize as companies. We need to change the way people work. If we want to solve those terrible statistics that I showed at the beginning of the talk, we need to stand up, become a rebel in our organization, and start pushing for these changes to happen. And if we are able to do so, as showing by the example of Buurtzorg as well, we can have a significant impact on how people feel at work, but also on how, as an organization, we can contribute to a better society. Thanks a lot for your attention. I'm 100% sure a lot of questions popped up. So let's dive into some of them to explore these organizations in a bit more detail.
Pim, you're absolutely right. And I love what you're saying there in terms of we all really have to be that rebel. Being a rebel is kind of a big thing to do. We think in our minds, but there are so many ways, as you've said already, we can already do that. Okay, let's jump into some of the questions right now that have been coming through. So first of all, actually from Milita, in terms of burnout. So was it easier to track burnout while we were mainly working on site? And what are the rates regarding the noted burnout cases over the past 2 years? So essentially what she's saying is during COVID, where people are working at home, what are the numbers in terms of burnout?
Well, from what we've seen is that the numbers haven't really gone up that much. So where a lot of people would have expected that the rates of burnouts would have increased significantly over the past 2 years, we've seen that it didn't really happen that much. Interestingly, these pioneering organizations have coped much better with the quick changes that happened over the past 2 years than more traditional organizations, because many of these pioneers already focused on working remotely or at least autonomously, giving their employees lots of freedom to make their own decisions. And therefore, making these bold changes over the next 2 years during the pandemic was much easier for these pioneering companies than it was for very traditional organizations that focused much more on top-down management, on rules and control. So the benefit of working more progressively weren't just interesting before the pandemic, because some of these companies have worked like this for 20 or 30 years already. But it has even more benefits in an even faster changing work environment, for example, that what we've seen over the past 2 years.
Okay, another question. If you could choose one of the trends that you've shared as the most crucial and the number one, what would you pick? What would you say?
Yeah, it's a question we get a lot, but it's an impossible one to answer, unfortunately. I can give my personal preference, but that doesn't mean it's the most important one. I think Creating a workplace around freedom and trust is so vitally important in creating an engaging and motivating workplace. And it's also something that I really hated about my previous job. The fact that there was no opportunity at all to take any initiative or be entrepreneurial, because people just wanted you to follow the rules, which were most of the time pretty childish rules. So, and what I've learned over the past couple of years, that if you are actually able to give people more freedom and autonomy, then there are so many benefits to it, not just to the individuals, but also to the organization itself. So that would be definitely my personal number one.
Okay, just lastly, in fact, something that struck me certainly at the beginning. So those statistics that you showed were quite shocking, in fact, and the statistic about just over 40% of people in the workplace are not finding meaning, in what they're doing, which is naturally causing all these other negative things as well. So if I was to ask you, what quick advice would you give to leaders that maybe to help them think about how to really give that meaning towards the people that are working with them? So how would you say companies should start thinking about the meaningful aspect of the work they do, if they haven't already done so? Just quickly, a couple of ideas.
Yeah, I think the worst thing to do is what many companies are currently doing at the moment, is to create these fancy commercials and branding around their so-called purpose and telling the story to the outside world that doesn't at all represent what's going on inside the company. I think it creates a strong disbalance between what is being communicated and what people in the organization actually feel. So don't focus on that. What you should instead focus on, even if you're just leading a team of a couple of individuals in a large organization, connect what people are doing to the purpose or the goal of the organization. And this doesn't always have to be a super lofty and noble cause, because in the end, people need to want to feel a purpose for themselves and how they contribute individually or as a team to what the organization tries to do. So find ways to connect what you're doing as a team to what the organization tries to do on a larger scale. And coming up with a couple of simple ways to do that is one of the most powerful ways to give people more sense of meaning and purpose in the workplace.
Listen, Pim, it's been a delight. I'm sure everybody who's been listening to you right now and who's watching this back next week at some stage as well will certainly find the value in this. Thank you so much. And again, everybody who's looking at this, if you're curious, you want to know more about what Pim is doing, you can reach out to him here or even LinkedIn as well. And I'm sure he'll be happy to connect. Pim, thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Right. What we will do now, we will take a very, very short break of about 3 or 4 minutes together. Remember, after the break, you'll see on the program, it's all about case studies. We've got 4 case studies. All you need to do is choose which case study you'd like to attend. And then we'll be meeting you back here for more case studies at HR Week 2021.